So, welcome back, Social 30. One of the things I mentioned on the first day of class is that Social 30 can be quite intimidating. There's a lot of work, and that you need to work together. And what we have here would be 3 students from last year, grad 2020, before they went to lockdown. They created a document where the 3 of them together made some notes about these sources that you have. And they decided that, you know what, if we are all editors of this document, and then we can keep adding to it what we think, and then maybe the 3 of us can do well on it. So they ended up creating this document here that has 34 pages, and the first 28 of them are about this set of sources that you have today. So I'm not telling you that because I want you to be intimidated that they had 28 pages of notes on these sources that you need to interpret tomorrow. Although that I could see how that could be intimidating. But I'm telling you this because I think you need to work together. That if you're going to try to do the course on your own, you're not going to get 100. You're definitely not going to finish the course as you want to. You need each other. So what they did was, obviously we talked about stuff in class, but they also said, you know what, let's create a document where the 3 of us can exchange information back and forth. So this was never an assignment. I didn't assign it to them, although it has my name on it. They didn't submit it to me. It was just a document that they used so that they could each do well on this A1. So they did the same A1. They didn't do it as their evaluation. They did it more as a practice kind of stuff. But yeah, they got some insightful stuff here. So lesson to be learned, work together. Work together. When you guys have essays that are looming, when you have sources that are take-home sources, then there's no reason to not talk to each other. That you're not really in competition with each other. It's the world is much bigger. You're in competition with 8 billion people, not the other 18 people in this class. So do work together on stuff. But let's talk about these 3 sources. And let's see what you came up with. So again, this is a test of related issue 1. But it is also a test to see if you have been looking at those guides to A1 and looking at the exemplars and figuring out how to do an A1. So let's look at source 1 and see if we can interpret it. So what is the first tool that comes to mind that you would use in a paragraph to talk about A1? How would you start your paragraph? Let's start there. So what kind of opening to your paragraph would you have for this interpretation tomorrow? Yes, sir.
Analyzing diction through that, finding an ideological perspective.
Okay, so that's very specific, right? Analyze the diction, the language, and through that, find an ideological perspective. Because this is a language-based source, that is the key to success, right? But that might not be your first sentence. Your first sentence might not be hey, a society, right? And jump right into it. You might have like a sentence before that. What might be your first sentence? So if this was an essay, which it's not, you would have an introduction, right? So how do you introduce this paragraph? What kind of topic sentence could you have for a paragraph that the paragraph's truly going to be about the interpretation of a source? Well, we need to establish explicitly what's on the page. So first step is just go with the what's on the page. Explicitly, source 1 is an extended quote about blank and blank, about the role of government and citizens. That's my first sentence. Something short, but something broad enough that it is a topic sentence to this paragraph. So the first step is just explicitly, this is what I see. And I'm not going to use the phrase I see. It's going to be more formal language than that. So source 1 is an extended quote about, and tell me the theme, right? About the relationship between government and government. So it's a quick little introduction. And then we get into let's analyze the diction, let's unpack the language so we can find an ideological perspective. So any questions about that first step? So first step, source 1 is an extended quote about the relationship between this and that. And e-papers at the provincial level begin like that. You don't need to wax poetically. You can just jump in. Source one is this. So you don't need to like have some kind of hook at the beginning. This isn't an essay. This is a more formulaic assignment. So therefore we can jump right in. Source one is this, and then we're going to dissect it. All right, so when we analyze the language, and I really borrowed this idea from Dan Raitz that used to teach here. It was a department head before I was, and then he moved on to Alberta Ed and has since retired. He goes through it and he dissects all of the key words. And he's like, a society where the government eliminates conflict, right? And then he pauses and he's like, okay. So this first fragment says, a society where the government eliminates conflict. Well, what's the alternative? Well, it could be a society where corporations eliminate conflict, or a society where the church eliminates conflict, a society where philanthropists eliminate conflict, a society where there is conflict. So even within that first phrase, a society where the government eliminates conflict, we can talk about the significance of the use of the word government, right? It's government, it's not church. It's government, it's not corporations. It's government, it's not, you know, I don't know what else there is. Church, corporations, and government. What else is there? Non-governmental citizen activist groups, I guess. So a society where the government eliminates conflict is a society that will be in conflict with the government. So we can unpack that first sentence and say, it's significant that they use the word government there. Because we're talking about a government-centric society. Government-centric society, not a corporate-centric or a religious-centric, but a government-centric society. So another tool that we can use when we unpack that first sentence is assumptions. That first sentence already tells me that this source, which is someone's ideological perspective, is based on an assumption. And there's an assumption inherent in that first sentence. So somewhere in my first 2 or 3 sentences of my interpreting this source, I'd say that, you know, the first sentence reveals an underlining assumption of the source, and that is blank, blank, blank. What's the underlying assumption based on that sentence? A society where the government eliminates conflict is a society that will be in conflict with the government. The assumption is yes, sir.
The government starts using too much control over people's lives, then people will start paying the price of government.
So that's an assumption, right? Absolutely right. So within that first sentence, we already can see a bias and an assumption. There's an anti-government bias because they have an assumption that as the government invests itself into our lives, it will create conflict. That's an assumption. So then we take the language, right? We took the language to find an assumption, and within the assumption, we can say these are the values that somebody with that assumption has. What are some values that someone with this assumption has? A society where the government eliminates conflict is a society that will be in conflict with the government. It's based on the assumption that government being invited into our lives will lead to some kind of dystopian controlled, lesser life. And that's based upon what value? What kind of value is this person promoting based upon the assumption that they've stated? Sir, yes, sir. Individualism. Right? Privacy from government. Individual rights and freedoms. So pages 71 to 85, boom, right there. You're not going to have the book open tomorrow. But today we have it as we prep for it. And we can say, you know what, this is assuming that we need individual rights and freedoms is more important than the collectivist value of security, the collectivist value of stability, that we'd rather be free than controlled. So already, we've looked at that first sentence fragment. We stopped at the word eliminates, and we said, okay, this is based on a government-centric, individual. They're looking at things not from a church or a corporation or a political activist group, but they're responding to a government-centric situation, and they're saying that there's an assumption here that government being invited into our lives will lead to, negative dystopian things, and in that assumption we can see a value of individualism. Is there any evidence, though, that this person's right? Can we use evidence to further the perspective? That's another tool. Use evidence to further the perspective. Although this first sentence is based on the assumption, it shows these values, which can also be illustrated through these case studies, through this evidence, through these observations. Now, the evidence could be hypothetical, so it could be from 1984, Brave New World kind of stuff, or other literature that you've seen or read. It could be theoretical, could be Hobbes, Locke, those guys. Could be historical, could be contemporary, could be personal. But do we have evidence that could be used to further the assumption and the perspective being shown in that first sentence? What's your evidence that a society where the government eliminates conflict is a society that will be in conflict with the government? So you have a government that tried to get rid of conflict, and because they did that, it created conflict. What's your best evidence? There's lots of evidence, but there's some evidence that's more judicious than others. So you could throw a Adolf Hitler's totalitarian regime at me, and I say, well, that's evidence, but that's not the most judicious evidence. There's more compelling evidence. There's more targeted evidence than Hitler's 1984, because I'm not sure Hitler was trying to eliminate conflict. He wasn't doing that. He was creating conflict. He was going to war with his neighbors. Eliminating conflict was not his agenda. So you need to find evidence that shows here's a government that it was their policy to eliminate conflict, but because they did that, they actually created conflict between themselves and the people. So what's the best evidence that you have? So here's a step to do an A1. Evidence that can be used to further the perspective of the source. What's your evidence? So society or a government parachutes themselves into the lives of people and says, you know what? You have conflict. I guess one thing we'd have to do is define what is conflict, right? Before we can maybe answer the evidence to further it, we might have to define what is conflict here. Is conflict because of economic disparity, haves and have-nots? Have and have not? Is it like a Marxist conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat? Is this a social conflict between social classes? Is it conflict based upon gender? Is it based upon ethnicity? What is the source of this conflict? Is it economic, political, social? Is it ideological conflict? So it just says conflict. We don't know what kind. So one thing we can do to massage out the nuances of the source is to suggest that the word conflict is vague enough that it could include many different types of conflict, including this, and this, political, economic, social, ideological, ethnic. But it does sound like a society where the government eliminates conflict. It's intra-societal conflict. It's not inter. It's not Canada against the US, it's Canada against Canada, right? It's intra. It's inside Canada conflict. So what's your example of a society where the government's like, oh man, there's a lot of conflict. Let's get rid of that. But how they get rid of it actually creates conflict between them and their citizens. What's your best evidence? I can think of two good pieces of evidence right now. What's the best one? It's okay. We've got like 25 minutes left. For all intents and purposes, I've done the other stuff, so you can think about it. Oh man, sit up. not looking forward to teaching 10 this afternoon, you know. Put my feet up. So, government tries to eliminate conflict, but now they've created conflict. It's okay to be wrong. My grade 10s won't shut up. Like, they just, hey, is it this? Is it? No, it's not that. You guys are like, I don't want to be wrong. Yes?
Could it be like,
Oh, I'm actually, we'll come to you next, but you've already given us two things. I thought I saw your hand up. 1984. So, hypothetical case study, 1984. A society says, you know what? Let's eliminate conflict. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that through the ministry of love. We're going to do that through the ministry of truth. We're going to do that through the joy camps. And through these joy camps, ministry of love, ministry of truth, what they end up doing is actually creating conflict. Winston Smith now has conflict with Big Brother because Big Brother is trying to be totalitarian. So the whole point is that in 1984, in Brave New World, in London of Orwell's 1984, the government injected itself into the lives of the people so totally, it created a conflict within Winston Smith. A conflict that they ended up ending by the end, by torturing him. That one certainly works. Did you have a different one? And?
I was gonna say like the communism in Russia, where they tried to
Yep.
like get on the level of everybody else so that they'd be safe, but in doing so they totally destroyed the lives of all the people.
And that was my other case study. So my other case study was an historic one, and it was, in a Marxist sense, Stalin tries to get rid of conflict within the USSR by providing egalitarianism, everybody's equal. But by providing egalitarianism, everyone's equal, he ended up losing the hearts and minds of the Soviet people. And what happens? The Soviet Union collapses because the people no longer valued the government. So a society where the government eliminates conflict, that was the agenda of the Soviet Union, of the Politburo. They try to get rid of economic conflict. They try to get rid of classes and just create one class. It's a society that will be in conflict with the government. And that's what happened, is that people became dissidents, voices of discontent, to the extent that the Soviet Union collapsed. They weren't just questioning the state policies, they were questioning the state itself and saying, we don't want to be in the USSR because our relationship with our government is so poisoned. Because the government has tried to lead us to this vision that we don't agree with. And the vision was an elimination of conflict. Those are the two case studies I thought of. So one way to unpack a source is to say, you know what, these are the key words here: government, conflict, eliminates. How are they going to do that? Use the language to find some assumptions. Assumption here, government's bad. What's a value? Individualism. Is there evidence to further that? Sure there is. 1984. And Stalin's USSR. Fun, right? A1 is the highest mental activity assignment in social studies. So it's harder to do this than an A2. A2 is you writing an essay where you get to defend your position. Here you got to figure out someone else's stuff. That's harder, right? Yes, I know in an essay you have to analyze the source first, so there still is that higher mental activity at the beginning, but then you get to go off and tell me what you think. This is just you telling me what someone else thinks. That's harder. That's harder. So that's why we spend so much time on A1. And sometimes the skills you get with A1 help you with multiple choice. So we have the assumptions, the values, we have evidence to further it. We could talk about the division of society. Not everyone would agree with that first sentence. Society's divided upon the assumptions that that first sentence is built upon. Hobbes would disagree. Hobbes would say we need to do this. So we can also use the division of society as a tool to unpack the source, to find a nuance. So Hobbes would disagree with the assumption underlining this first sentence, whereas Locke and Mill and other individualists and liberalists would agree. We can talk about the significance. Why is it important that we address the first sentence. In order to talk about the significance of it, we often say, within the source, there's a problem and a solution. So another tool that we use to unpack a source is to say, I see a problem here. And there's a solution that we can infer that the speaker wants. And within the solution and the problem, there is significance here. This is a significant issue. So another step needed is to say, you know what, here I see a problem. And here's the solution that we can infer the person wants. It's probably going to be implicit. It might not be stated outright. And this is why it's a significant problem. If left unaddressed, this is how bad things get. That's the significance. If left unaddressed, this is what happens. So if left unaddressed, in a hypothetical sense, we become Winston Smith. Right? That's why this is significant. If left unaddressed, if we don't challenge the usurpation of freedom from a government that's trying to eliminate conflict, we become Winston Smith. That was why Orwell wrote the book. It's because he knew in a liberal democracy it was possible for us to become controlled. We're only one sentence in. That's how they wrote 28 pages on this. It's so amazing how much stuff you can get from these. And that's why when I mark them at the provincial level, and we're like, oh man, this is a PF or this is an E, I'm like, what? This is fairly simple. So even if you can't do everything that we're talking about, if you can do a lot of what we're talking about, you're going to score really highly on this part if you end up writing it. Because I really don't know, right? I don't know if there will be a diploma or if you choose to write it, but I have to assume that there is and that you have to write it. So, instead, the state must recognize that the division of people is natural and necessary. Boom, that's the solution. Remember I just said that in every source there's a problem and solution? In that second sentence, we see a solution. First sentence is a problem, second sentence is a solution. And with these solutions, there's more assumptions, more values. There might be evidence that would argue in favor of it, evidence that you could argue against it. You could unpack the language. You could say, what does it mean, division of people? How are we dividing people? What does it mean, people? It's natural. Is this social Darwinism? Try to label it as an ideology. Is the division of people natural? Is that social Darwinism? Is that survival of the fittest? Is that elitist? And why would it be necessary? Is that capitalist? Is the division of people necessary so it can unlock the invisible hand and unleash the true wealth of the nation? Keep in mind, I'm not reading off any notes up here. Right? So, again, I get it. I've taught the course a few times. I haven't read the textbook since 2009. Right? You just gotta keep learning it. And as you keep learning it, it becomes easy. It really does. Instead, the state must recognize that the division of people, what's that going to look like? What does division of people look like? Are we talking about class division? Is it celebrating the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie? If so, Marx would be offended by that. The only role for government is to protect the unique interests of all minorities. Okay, Adam Smith agrees that we're not talking about anarchy. We're saying that government does have a role to protect our private property. So government upholds contractual law. That's why we still have a government in the capitalist society, so that I can't just, with my gun tonight, come to your house and take your car. Well, I can, but I should get arrested. So the only role for government is to protect the unique interests of all minorities. So when I see the word minority, I think, what? What do you think when you hear the word minority? Just say it. Probably ethnic, right? Maybe cultural minorities, ethnic minorities, visual minorities. That's not what this is saying, is it? The only role for government is to protect the unique interests of all minorities, especially Irish Canadians? No. People named McBride? No. Especially those few that truly understand the free market. Holy crap. Who's the minority that they just said? Rich. Capitalists, the robber barons, the nouveau riche, the magnates of industry, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. In Canada, you know, we have different family names. We have, Rogers, the Rogers families. Who are the fish people from down east, the Atlantic people? You know, we could do a quick search, Google search, richest people in Canada. So in an Edmonton sense, we're talking about the dude who owns the Oilers, right? These are the people that the government should protect. It's like, wait a minute, what? So the government should be protecting the unique interests of the rich from the tyranny of the majority. So this is the 1% against the 99%, but the government coming to the aid of the 1%. So this is the reverse of the Occupy movement. This is the government saying, you know what, we need to protect the 1%. This is Ronald Reagan, this is Margaret Thatcher, this is neoliberalism, this is the Neocon Agenda. This is what we've seen post-1976 in the UK, where governments have come to the aid of the elite. So, what might that look like? How would they protect the rich from the tyranny of the majority? What might they do? So this is the implicit part. It doesn't actually say, we're going to do this, but we can imply that's what they mean that they're going to do. How can the majority create tyranny for the rich? Yes?
Make it harder for the majority to become rich.
Yeah. So the minority, right? How can the majority tyrannize the rich? The majority are like the average Canadians. The rich are like billionaires, right? How can we make life harder for the billionaires? Taxation, right? So the biggest way for me to kick the rich and get away with it is to encourage my government to raise income and maybe even introduce wealth tax. Because there's a lot of rich people with low income, but they have a lot of wealth. So what we're talking about is taxation. That's the tyranny of the majority. The word's not there, taxation, but that's what they're referring to, is taxation. So this source is anti what kind of taxation? Where the rich pay more. The source is anti-taxation system where the rich pay more. What's that word called? And I'm only being a jerk about it because we've used the words in the last 3 days, and a glossary of key terms is one of the things I'm asking you to keep track of. So what's the word? And we're a group of 19 right now. So I'm not holding one person responsible, I'm holding all of you responsible. What's the word that means that you tax rich people more than poor? That as you make more money, you pay higher tax. It's the taxation system we have in Canada. We don't have flat tax. Not every Canadian pays the same income tax. Higher income, higher taxation rate. It is progressive taxation. So this source might be in favor of the opposite of progressive. Rather than punishing the rich, we need to unleash their unique insight. Maybe we need regressive taxation. Oh, you made more? You can pay less. Because by making more wealth, you've already helped grow the economy. So you made $40,000 last year, you have to pay 40% taxes. This guy made $4 million last year, you can pay 10% taxes. Because we want there to be an incentive for you to work harder. And if you're just going to be taxed more if you work harder, where's the incentive? So this is a very right-wing, economic, individualist, capitalist, anti-progressive taxation statement at an economic level. And then we could go back and talk about it at a social level and a political level, and then at the end you'd have a paragraph that's, maybe longer than a page. You're going to look at it and say, man, I interpreted that source comprehensively. I broke it down into its nuances, into its little beady pieces, and I talked about their significance. Fun times, right? So we have time to do one of the other two, but not both. Which one do you want to talk about? Source 2 it is. So look at 2. Maybe at the beginning of class, tomorrow before we get started, you can ask me some quick questions about 3 or about relationships. And again, these are quotes that they're not below the diploma level or above, like the language. This is the diploma level. This is what you could see on your diploma. This is the type of language. So that's why I'd like you to be pre-exposed to it. If Western society is to pride itself on its morality and decency, it can no longer ignore the plight of marginalized people within its borders. There's an assumption there, or a statement, that we're doing what, and we're guilty of it. We're ignoring the plight of marginalized people. So the problem that it sees is that there's a plight of marginalized people, and we're not doing enough about it. So in order to unpack this source, we're going to have to probably at some point describe why is the word plight used? And why is the word plight used? What kind of tone does it create? What kind of urgency does it create? You know, this person purposely chose the word plight. This person purposely chose the word plight. I was trying to use more P's there. But, you know, why is it significant that they use the word plight? What does marginalized look like? Who is a marginalized person? Are you economically marginalized? Politically? Socially? Are you marginalized because of your gender? Because of your creed? Because of your religion? How are people marginalized within Western society? These are all parts of unpacking it. Whereas some people will read right past that and they'll ignore the significance of the phrase, the plight of marginalized people, and in my mind, they should get a 40 because it's incomplete. You've missed it. And there's an important other part of that first sentence. And it says that in Canada, we shouldn't care about what's happening in Mexico. You see it? Because it says, ignore the plight of marginalized people within its borders. So we need to help people in Canada, but there's people struggling in South Sudan. That can't be our concern. So this is not a globalist perspective. This is a nationalist perspective. And I got that from the last 3 words of the first sentence. Because we're trying to find an ideology. This is nationalist, not globalist. Because it's saying within our borders, not outside. You use the language to reveal what's there. And it's not hard by the end of the course. There is no art in turning a goddess into a witch. Obviously, that's figurative language, right? A saint into a sinner. But in the opposite operation, to give dignity to what has been scorned, that can lift people to another plane of existence. So now we need to use evidence to unpack what the heck does all that figurative language mean? How has a Western society turned a goddess into a witch? When have we had a goddess among us that the people or the government have created into a witch? When have we taken a saint and the people or the government have turned on the saint and made them into a sinner? When have we turned people that had dignity, the next part is, how can we take people that have been scorned by the group and to return dignity to them? How do we give dignity back? That they're saying we give dignity back, that's the solution to a problem. How do we do that? How do we give dignity back? You need to tell me that. And working on your own tonight, you're not maybe going to figure it out. Maybe you need to ask each other, how the heck do you do that? What evidence do we have that people can be scorned and through some government program, dignity can be returned to them? Or through some societal initiative, through some non-governmental organization, we can return dignity to those who have been scorned. So, I'll give you a little hint. Living in Alberta, surrounded by communities that have been affected by residential schools, I think people that are survivors of residential schools might say that they were scorned. How do you give dignity back to a culture that have been scorned? And then how, by doing that, do we lift Canada to another plane of existence? How do you define that plane of existence? What new characteristic or quality has been earned or gained when you give dignity to people who've been scorned. Maybe people were scorned because they were a suffragette. And we scorned them by beating them in the streets and saying women are not equal, they're not people. But then later we're like, oh crap, you're wrong, women are people. So how do you make that right? How do you go from lynching African Americans in the south of the United States to electing Barack Obama? How do you go from scorning people to elevating them and honoring them? Think about it. Post 9/11, we have a Western society that's very Arab-ophobic. So how do you dignify that? How do you take away from the racial profiling and return back some kind of sense of respect? Something to think about. Hi. So the hardest part of the assignment is probably your relationship. So I'd ask you to look over some of the notes I gave you on relationships. Key point, if you don't do this, you'll get 40% on relationship. Your relationship paragraph has to begin with an overarching theme. How many people remember hearing that before? Overarching theme. And the overarching theme should be a to what extent umbrella question. So like, to what extent should the government inject itself into our lives to better our lives, kind of stuff. Something like that. There's probably more than one question. So, today's day 3, and we're looking at something that you can see at the end, just to show you where we're headed, to give you some urgency, but also so that you can set up the network of help that you need to get through the course. You guys need to help each other. Absolutely. Bring that sheet back. Whatever you write on, it's fine for tomorrow. So if you write all over this sheet, that's okay. If you took notes today and it's on a different sheet, bring that sheet in too. You can bring your notes tomorrow. Use your notes. But you can't just use all of my handouts. That's too much. I want you to actually have to process something. If you have any questions, you can always stay at lunch. But I know how you must be like 3 hours into this course being like, dude, I just gotta get out of here. Like, this is enough of this. I totally understand and respect that.